Welcome to Climate Change with Scott Amyx. I'm your host, Scott, and today I'm joined by Tribeca Costa, who is an American sociobiologist and a futurist. Welcome, Tribeca.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Now, you have a very interesting global upbringing. I just found out that you're half Japanese. You were raised in Japan, but you also lived in Laos during the Vietnam conflict. Can you kind of share a little bit about that upbringing?
Well, I didn't know it at the time. You know, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, kids didn't know what their dad really did. Their dad left in the morning, went to work, and came back. I know, we didn't have the fathers that hold the babies, on their chest and play with them and all that. We had fathers that went to work and provided for you. And so I had no idea that my father was working for the CIA, and that's why we were stationed in Japan. We were on the outskirts of an air base. And during the Vietnam conflict, the CIA developed illegal air bases in Laos and Cambodia that wanted to remain neutral countries rather than pick sides. Of course, that didn't work out too well. The Khmer Rouge, as you know, invaded Cambodia, and the Pathet Lao, which was a version of that, invaded Laos. Eventually, we were evacuated to Thailand, and from Thailand, made our way back to California. And about that time, my dad said, the war was too hot, and it was not a safe place for civilians. Now, I could argue that that's not a place you take kids, but my dad was Portuguese and Italian. He believed in keeping the family together in spite of the fact that we could have died of dysentery or been murdered or any other thing. And looking back on it now, having had my own family, I certainly wouldn't have drugged them into the middle of a war, but every parent makes their own decision. So,
well, interesting, because I was just about to ask you in terms of the rationale as to why he had his family with him, certainly in Laos during that conflict. I mean, it's hard enough growing up in a military base situation in Japan, but then to actually go into the middle of war and it's a secretive operation. I'm just surprised that the CIA did have a degree of separation for the families. But fortunately, you're safe and your family's safe. And I guess you were too young, but can you kind of bring us up a little bit more current in terms of how that upbringing, some of the things that maybe you didn't know at the time, but now you start to appreciate, how does that resiliency and perspective prepared you for the work that you've been doing?
Well, first of all, I was raised as a Japanese. So my perspective is very much a social perspective. It's what's good for society, and I feel very deferential as an individual in a Western culture. I defer to the greater good, and that just comes naturally to me. Having been exposed to the tragedy of war, murder, death, disease, violence, I got to see the real savage nature of humans at a very, very young age. And I had the good stewardship of my parents to make me feel secure as I was an observer of these things. We lived in when we were in Laos, we lived in a compound in the middle of the jungle, and we had armed guards with automatic weapons constantly circulating a 12-foot wall that we lived in the middle of. And we rode armored cars to the embassy school. So we were pretty secure while we were there until, of course, the Pathet Lao invaded Vientiane, and then we were evacuated out. I never felt any direct threat. But then when you're a child, you must remember that you think your family's like everybody else's family. You don't really know it's weird until much later on. And then you start talking to other people and you think, we didn't really grow up that way. And so much later, you kind of get into revisionist history as you begin to interpret what happens. What it gave for me was a global perspective. I was probably exposed to too much of the world as it really is at too young of an age, and yet I didn't have the insecurity of being a victim of war.
Yeah, that is incredibly profound, because I think anybody else perhaps in that similar situation, again, given the fact that there's still a lot of youthfulness and innocence, is that it could easily have scarred them for life. And yet I think you have come out of that, emerge in a different way, and then actually use a lot of the work that you do and the platform that you have to be able to actually talk about some of the challenges that affects the environment, affects the social society as well. Let's fast forward many, many years into a company that you worked at, Terra Corp. And then eventually you left that organization and started your own marketing agency, and you sold that after about 4 years of operation. Can you give us kind of a summary of that period for you?
Yeah, that period for me was Silicon Valley was exploding on all fronts. And in many ways, that was the perfect environment for me to have left college and to have started my career, because I had a great sense of courage and adventure. And really, I wasn't frightened by much. I wasn't frightened when a CEO asked me into his office and asked me for my opinion. I actually gave it. and I wasn't afraid, because I knew they can't kill you. You can't die from those things. And so everything that was happening to me in my career was really against this backdrop of there's no imminent threat of death. And so I think that when you come out of those kinds of environments, there are two things that happen to you. One, you're rather fearless, but that's not the same as courageous, maybe. I don't know. I'd have to think about that one. And the second thing is you become a very fast adapter. Whatever environment you're thrown into, you are able to distill the essential components that are required for you to prevail. And I got very good at that. I could walk into literally any technology situation, and there could be millions of variables, but I was able to focus in on only those variables that mattered. And over time, that led to a career as being the global expert on fast adaptation. So you can see that this started in my childhood, growing up and being deferential to social norms and society, then being thrown into very, very perilous situations. I really had to adapt to foreign countries and foreign situations and dangerous situations very quickly. And that gave me a great curiosity about how and what techniques are required to adapt very quickly and very successfully and efficiently.
Well, I think it reflects very well in terms of not only your intellect, but your ability, like you said, to adapt. And it is interesting because, you were raised in a Japanese culture, and some Japanese, I think they tend to be risk averse and have issues with rapid change. So it is interesting that you're able to kind of counterbalance some of those other cultural nuances. Now, you made
Well, at the time I was in Japan, bear in mind, there were very, very few, I would say, Caucasians that were completely fluent in Japanese and raised as a Japanese. This was a kind of an anomaly. And I will tell you how much of an anomaly it was. Frequently, I'd be riding trains because, public transportation is how you get around. I'd be riding trains and people standing next to me in Japanese would be talking about me, because there were no Caucasians that spoke Japanese, or very few, and you wouldn't run into them on trains and buses and in snack shops on the street. And so because of that, frequently, they would say things like, oh, American girls have such nice long legs. And I'd turn around and in perfect Japanese, which was my first language, say, well, I don't know, there's some Japanese women that have lovely legs also. And they'd go, oh my gosh, bow their heads in embarrassment. So, I was still adapting.
Interesting.
I was adapting because I don't look Japanese. I have blonde hair, and I got all the Italian and Portuguese genes, and I just didn't look Japanese, even though my entire family, I had 100 Japanese family members, and everything about me was Japanese except for my appearance. So there was still that adaptation going on every day that I was unconscious of.
Well, it's really interesting. I really, really appreciate you putting that context, because now there's a pattern that's starting to emerge. And it's not surprising that you then made that transition from running your own agency to then taking the time to actually really thoughtfully write your first book, Watchman's Rattle, Radical New Theory of Collapse, and which was considered one of the best green books back in 2010. The question I have for you is, why was that such a wake-up call book for people?
Well, first of all, let's be honest, the book was a dark horse. When I took it to the publishers in New York, I was lucky to get an agent. And I say lucky because I'd never published a book before. And when I took it there and I said, look, I see a pattern emerging. of ancient civilizations and modern civilization. And I'm not very interested in the triggering event that causes a society to unilaterally collapse. I'm interested in, was there any way that the person on the street was behaving that set them up so that a triggering event could move very quickly and cause all these social institutions to collapse? And by that, I was talking about the Romans, the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. So I began, when I sold my company in Silicon Valley, I had the luxury of getting notebooks out. And I found I had about 90 notebooks where I had been observing these patterns that were going on. And so I thought, well, I'll see if I could write a book. I knew I could write a paper. You know, that you do that in science all day long. But I didn't know if I could do a long format. I didn't know if I had the patience or the perseverance to do it. And even after I got the book done, I didn't have confidence. I need people to know that this was a dark horse. And when they asked me, the publisher asked me, hey, how many copies are you going to sell? My answer was, I'm pretty sure people in my family will buy a copy. That was my truthful answer. I had no idea, because I was writing a book that was basically blending what was occurring in society today with sociobiology. And it's not like there's a big demand for that. So I wrote the book, and it wound up, as you know, going to 27 countries, becoming a bestseller. It's still in the top 1% of Amazon sales 8 years later. And so the publisher couldn't have been happier. And, you know, of course, the first thing they say after congratulations is, well, what are you working on now? So, you know, and then I followed that up with a book on how artificial intelligence is allowing us to more proactively change our future outcomes, called On the Verge. So, you know, but I'm very slow, I must say. It takes me 6 or 7 years to write one book. It's not like I'm cranking these out. I have to do a lot of research, and I'm very slow, and I like to go back and look at the original source material and confirm everything and then reconfirm it. And, you know, I'm not a productive writer.
Well, I think you're being incredibly modest, but I certainly appreciate that completeness and thoroughness. Going back to your first book, what was that kind of core overriding message around climate change and sustainability that you were trying to bring to the forefront?
Well, there were two important messages relative to climate change. The first is we know that as social systems and as the information that the person on the street has to really contend with gets more and more complex, our brains are really not geared to deal with complexity. We're finding that out with the current COVID-19 debacle. When there is a problem that exponentiates, our brains are not designed to understand exponentiation. What we understand is linear thinking. So when I go to people and I give them very easy problems, I go, listen, there's a pond with a lily pad in it, and one lily pad, and every day the number of lily pads is going to double. So let's just say on day 36, the entire pond will be covered with lily pads. And the pond will be an ecological disaster. The fish will begin to die. You know, it'll crowd out all the other natural vegetation, so on and so forth. So I ask people, so on what day is the pond only half full? It's not really a problem. Well, the linear brain that's evolved will say 36, half of 36 is 18. So on day 18, the pond is half full of lily pads. On day 36, you know, it's full. And I go, no. No, day 35, 24 hours before the ecological disaster. Day 35, the pond is half full. There's peace in the kingdom and it looks fine. 24 hours later, you're in meltdown.
Yeah.
So similar to the COVID situation, you think you have 18 days. When a problem is exponentiating, you always think you have more time than you do. You make the error of thinking you have 18 days to solve the problem, when in fact you have 24 hours. So it seems like these problems turn into emergencies overnight. Hey, it wasn't a problem in January. How come we're shutting down the whole country, you know, suddenly 60 days later? And we have the same problem relative to climate change. Climate change is an exponentiating problem. And the human brain, to this point in time, is not evolved to understand exponentiation unless you're a scientist, right? And you're imbued to think that way. So that is one problem. But a second problem that we have is that the data is too complex. And when data becomes too complex, it's very easy to manipulate for political reasons. And so somebody cherry picks a fact here and bloviates that, and somebody cherry picks a fact on the other side, and people are generally confused. You ask the people on the street and they say, there's probably climate change, but I don't know. And I don't know is a truthful answer. They're not trained to look at the data. So we've got the exponentiation, we've got the complexity, and then we've got a third problem, which is a physiological problem. We are not geared physiologically to respond to long-term danger. This is a very important point. If I throw a snake down in front of you, your body is filled with chemicals and you go into fight or flight. It's just automatic. But if I start to tell you about, you better say, you know, if you're like 18 and I say you need to save for retirement or buy life insurance, you can't get an 18-year-old's attention. You can't get a 30-year-old's attention, because the further out a problem is, the less it's prone to instigate action. And so we've got this double whammy. We have an exponentiating problem that's highly complex, that we don't understand and don't know who to believe, and can be easily manipulated. The data can be easily manipulated. And then we have this third problem where the problem seems kind of far out, 20 years, 30 years. If you can't convince people to save money for retirement 30 years out, you're not going to convince them to change their behavior over climate change. And so we have that problem going. If you look at all these problems, they're really the result of evolution. They're the result of this spacesuit, this physiological spacesuit, and how it's wired to behave and how it does behave in the face of danger. And so these things are really giant obstacles in getting people to change their behavior over a problem that's far out and exponentiating.
Yeah, I really like the way you frame this up, because it really starts to make a lot more cognitive sense in terms of some of the structural misalignment. So, the climate change summits happen, the youth climate change strikes happen, yet the action, the legislation, the capital deployment, it's just not quite matching up. And I think that's a framework that you just explained that makes a lot of sense, but at the same time, to your point, presents a very difficult obstacle because it is fundamental to the way we have evolved as human species. So in light of that, how do we start to look at big problems that are truly exponential?
Well, we're beginning to do that. I trust machine learning more than I trust humans. Because, and I get a lot, believe me, I get a lot of guff on that. People go, that's not normal. There should be a disease, psychological disease named after that. Not if you know what I know. I know humans are vulnerable to prehistoric emotions. And they do things that were genetically, inherited behaviors that are really not in their best interest all the time. So to think that man is this rational animal, that if you give him the data, that he will respond rationally, is really a wrong way to approach a problem. You must look at humans as irrational for purpose, because it allowed us to survive to this point in time. When you understand how the human organism really operates and is designed and created to operate, then you will trust machines more. And we're already starting to. You ask a neighbor, hey, do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? And the neighbor goes, oh yeah, absolutely 100%. And then you walk into your house and you go, Alexa, what's the weather for tomorrow? And Alexa says, it'll be raining for, 30 minutes, and then it'll be sunshine and a high of 97. Who are you going to believe? You're going to believe your neighbor? No, you're going to believe Alexa. So we're already starting to rely on computers, on cell phones, on home smart devices. And that transition's already beginning to happen. And that's going to help us a great deal, because if we start to put our trust in devices that are neutral, right, that are not manipulating complex information, can give it to us simply in a method that we can use and act on, then there's some possibility that we get the information we need to make better decisions.
Yeah, I'm kind of ruminating on it, and to see if in fact that's a valid logic or not. I want to, for the sake of time, actually kind of do a little bit of forward thinking because you're also a futurist as well, and this kind of ties into on the Verge. So to your point is the empirical data and the trust on empirical data. Again, as scientists, I think we rarely just simply look at the results. We have to look at the methodology, the sources of the data, and how it was actually derived to even validate the result. But we're not going to go there for just a second. Let's say that fast forward, we learn to depend mission critical decisions, business as well as personal micro level decisions on machines. What does that mean for humans? And more importantly, how do we evolve from kind of prehistoric DNA model to, let's say, transhumanism or something that could be a blend of the two?
Well, it's already happening. I'm in my 60s, and most of my friends have gotten knee replacements or hip replacements, and heart stents. I mean, it's rare that I run into a friend. Maybe my friends aren't healthy. I don't know, but it's rare that I run into a friend at my age who doesn't have some replacement or artificial device internally in their bodies. So it's already beginning to happen. You see soldiers coming back and having robotic arms and legs and so on and so forth. So we're already seeing that that deferring to mechanical devices and intelligence. That deferential trend is already beginning to occur. I frankly think that's a good thing. I think it's good for critical decisions to be made by machines and not by man. And yes, there are some issues with verifying data or the potential for manipulation of the data that goes into AI models. But remember, AI systems are smarter than humans. And so they know when they're being manipulated. They know when you're trying to skew the loading of data. They can detect that kind of activity. And not only that, I mean, just look at a $200 facial recognition software package. You'd be able to, if you had that on me right now, you'd be able to say, well, she's exaggerating here. I ought to ask a different question. And she's lying about this, or or she tried to deflect on this. And you would be able to tell a lot of things that you just can't tell just in a human to human conversation. So we have to understand these machines are smarter than us, and they will detect any malfeasance. And to that extent, it is better to trust machines to make these decisions than it is humans. Humans, as I'm going to quote Ed Wilson, who was kind enough to endorse my book and who has been a mentor of mine throughout my whole life. He said, "We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and that's our problem."
So on that note, I've been joined by Rebecca Costa, who is a sociobiologist and futurist. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you.